England, 1965. In the rolling hills of Devon, nestled between fields of heather and winding country roads, the Higgins family lived in a stately ivy-covered manor that had stood for generations. The village of Dunwich Hollow, where they resided, was the sort of place where people left their doors unlocked and knew the names of their neighbors' pets. It was a quiet hamlet, seemingly untouched by time. And then on a brisk October morning, the silence was broken. Not by a cry for help, nor the sound of sirens, but by the eerie realization that the entire Higgins family had vanished without a trace. They were not a family known for eccentricity or secrecy. Edward Higgins, the patriarch, was a respected solicitor who commuted weekly to Exeter. His wife, Margaret, was a pillar of the village church committee, known for her warm scones and unwavering politeness. Their children, Lily 10 and James 13, attended the local school, and though James had a curious mind and Lily was often seen scribbling in her little sketch pad under the old yew tree, they seemed no more unusual than any other children their age. In every outward sense, the Higginses were ordinary, perhaps too ordinary to ever expect anything strange would come their way. The first sign that something was amiss came on a Thursday morning, when Mr. Callum, the village milkman, arrived at the Higgins property around 6:30 a.m., as he always did. He noted with mild confusion that the front gate was ajar, something Edward typically kept secured. Approaching the doorstep, he saw the morning newspaper still rolled up on the stoop, untouched. Even stranger, the house was utterly silent. Not a light flickered. No radio hummed. No movement stirred behind the drawn curtains. He knocked once, then twice. Receiving no answer, and knowing Margaret usually greeted him with a smile or wave through the window, he grew uneasy. He peered through the frosted glass beside the door and saw something odd. The dining table set for 4, plates untouched, as if the family had been about to eat and simply got up mid-meal. Through the haze of condensation, he could just make out a half-finished glass of milk beside a child's plate, and the silhouette of chairs pushed back, not tucked in. By midday, word had begun to spread. No one had seen the children at school. Edward hadn't shown up at work in Exeter. Margaret missed the weekly church flower arrangement. Neighbors, initially brushing it off as an impromptu family trip, soon began to sense something was wrong. A few villagers, including the vicar and the local doctor, decided to investigate. They entered the house through the back door, which, inexplicably, was unlocked. Inside, the manor stood frozen in time. The clocks had all stopped at 2:17 a.m. A kettle sat cold on the stove, and a faint scent of burned toast lingered in the air. Upstairs, the beds were unmade. Children's clothes were strewn across chairs as if laid out for the next day. Edward's briefcase sat beside the hall table, still packed for the following morning commute. Yet there was no sign of forced entry, no footprints in the dew-soaked lawn, and nothing, absolutely nothing, to suggest violence or foul play. The police were called by evening, and Detective Inspector Thomas Arkwright was dispatched from Exeter. A man known for his methodical approach and skepticism toward superstition, he walked through the Higgins house with a furrowed brow and a notebook that soon filled with questions and no answers. He found no fingerprints beyond the family's, no broken locks or misplaced items. Their dog, a black spaniel named Chester, was gone as well, although his leash remained by the front door. A search party combed the woods and fields surrounding Dunwich Hollow for days, but no trace of the family was ever found. Not a scarf, not a footprint, not even a dropped toy. Local authorities brought in divers to check the nearby creek, cadaver dogs to sniff through the hedgerows, and even RAF aerial scouts to examine the terrain. It was all useless. It was as if the Higgins family had simply ceased to exist. Villagers whispered quietly behind closed doors. Some recalled how James had been seen watching the sky for hours the week before, muttering about lights no one else saw. Others mentioned Lily's strange drawings, geometric patterns that no one could interpret, left behind in her notebook, which police collected and stored as evidence. A few said Margaret had been unwell lately, worried about visitors in the night, though they had dismissed it as nerves. Whatever these fragments of memory meant, they only deepened the mystery. For those in Dunwich Hollow, the day the Higgins family disappeared marked the end of innocence. The house stood undisturbed in the weeks that followed, guarded by police tape and silence. And though people tried to return to their routines, nothing felt quite right. The wind through the trees seemed heavier. Children hesitated to walk past the Higgins property, and even the most skeptical of villagers began to admit, in hushed tones, that something unnatural had taken place. The family was never found. In the days following the disappearance of the Higgins family, Dunwich Hollow fell under a quiet spell. The village, usually alive with the sounds of passing bicycles, gossiping neighbors, and barking dogs, grew hushed. People still went about their daily routines, shopping at the greengrocer's, tending to gardens, walking to church, but everything felt different, as if the village itself had drawn in a breath and forgotten how to exhale. Whispers began to circulate, first cautiously, and then with mounting urgency, about the strange things the villagers had noticed in the weeks leading up to that October night. Mrs. Tillman, who lived just across the lane, was the first to speak openly about it. She told the local vicar over tea that she had seen a tall man in a dark coat standing outside the Higgins property late at night 3 times in the past fortnight. "He didn't knock," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Just stood there, like he was listening for something inside." When she asked Edward about it in passing, he brushed it off with a polite smile and said it was likely someone from work, but something in his eyes, tired, strained, told a different story. Others began to recall odd encounters as well. Mr. Penrose, the postmaster, remembered a curious package arriving for Edward in early September. It bore no return address and was sealed tightly in wax, marked only with a symbol none of the village folk recognized. 3 concentric circles interlocked by a triangle. Penrose had meant to ask Edward about it, but never got the chance. That package was never found during the police search, nor was it listed in the house's inventory. Then there were the sounds. Several neighbors reported hearing strange noises from the Higgins home late at night. A low humming, like machinery, followed by sudden silences, and what one described as a sharp, metallic clicking. Margaret's piano, usually silent after sundown, was heard playing faintly around midnight one evening, just a few wandering notes, not a full tune. When Mrs. Lockett, a close friend of Margaret's, asked her about it the next day, Margaret simply said, "Sometimes the house sings back to us." It wasn't just the adults who noticed things. A group of school children, including Lily's best friend, Maisie, said that Lily had become different in the final week. She'd stopped playing tag and hopscotch, and instead spent most of her time drawing in her notebook or staring at the sky, especially after lunch. When asked what she was looking for, Lily had whispered, "They're coming back soon," but not for everyone. Maisie, visibly shaken when questioned by police, said Lily showed her a page in her sketchbook that featured a drawing of the Higgins house surrounded by shadowy figures with no faces. At the center of the image was a clock with its hands spinning backward. That drawing, like the package, was never found among Lily's belongings. The most troubling account came from Reverend Hollingsworth, who said Margaret had come to confession 2 Sundays before the family vanished. Though he couldn't disclose the details, he confided later, reluctantly and only to Inspector Arkwright, that she seemed unmoored, speaking vaguely of sins not her own, of broken promises, and things that should never have been awakened. She mentioned Edward had been researching something he had sworn never to return to, something from his days before the war that he'd buried deep. He brought it home, she had said, and now it listens. By this point, the whispering had become constant, stretching into every corner of the village. Theories abounded. Some said the Higginses had gotten involved in espionage, others blamed occult practices. A few even muttered about alien abduction. But in private, away from daylight and stiff upper lips, many admitted to a sense of being watched in those final days, a weight in the air, flickering lights, dreams that didn't feel like dreams. Detective Arkwright, meanwhile, began collecting these anecdotes, reluctantly at first, then obsessively. His official report made no mention of them, of course, only the facts, the timeline, the absence of evidence. But in his personal journal, later found hidden in a false drawer in his desk, he wrote, "The villagers know more than they admit. Something unnatural bled into their lives through that family. They felt it too." It wasn't long before people stopped walking past the Higgins property entirely. Children were told to stay away. The postman refused to deliver to the gate. Over time, the vines grew thicker on the walls as if the house itself wanted to hide. Yet late at night, some claimed to hear the faint sound of a girl laughing or music that had no source. The villagers never spoke of it publicly again, but in their private moments, when the wind howled or shadows stretched too long across the lane, many remembered the weeks before the Higgins family vanished, and how, even then, the strange had already begun to settle quietly into the village. Whatever took them did not come suddenly. It had been circling, waiting. Detective Inspector Thomas Arkwright arrived in Dunwich Hollow 3 days after the Higgins family vanished. The drive from Exeter had been quiet, mist curling low over the fields as if nature itself was unsure of what was unfolding. Arkwright was a seasoned investigator, a man known not for flair or drama, but for his stubborn adherence to logic and fact. He had solved murders, kidnappings, and frauds, and had never once failed to deliver a conclusion. But as he stepped out of his Morris Oxford and walked up the gravel paths toward the Higgins house, something tightened in his chest, an inexplicable pressure that refused to be shaken off. From the outset, the case refused to behave like any other. There was no forced entry, no signs of struggle. The house was, in his words, eerily untouched, like a museum exhibit staged to freeze time. The dinner plates were still out. Shoes remained by the doorway. In Edward's study, a cigar rested in the ashtray, still half burned. But no signs of the family, not even a shoe out of place, suggested panic or haste. In most disappearances, there's a trail, even if faint. People don't simply dissolve into nothing. And yet here it seemed they had. Moi, he spent hours walking through the house that first day. The children's rooms were filled with toys and books, the bedspreads wrinkled from recent use. Arkwright noted Lily's sketchbook on the window seat. Only 2 pages were filled, the rest had been torn out. What remained showed a strange pattern resembling a spiral maze surrounding what looked like a door in the sky. He made a note of it, but didn't understand its importance yet. It was in the study where he began to sense that something was wrong on a level beyond the physical. The air in that room was cold, unnaturally so. Despite the autumn chill, the rest of the house remained temperate. But here, behind the heavy oak desk, it felt as though the walls themselves had soaked up something deeper than cold. On the far wall stood the grandfather clock, a handsome piece of craftsmanship that had belonged to Margaret's grandfather. The glass pane over the face was cracked, but the time was frozen precisely at 2:17 a.m., a detail he couldn't ignore, especially when he learned from the milkman that the family was last seen alive around midnight. The days passed, and the investigation deepened, though not in the direction Arkwright had hoped. There were no fingerprints beyond the family's, no signs of a break-in, no financial troubles, no known enemies. Edward Higgins's office in Exeter offered no clues, just a neatly ordered desk and a list of clients, none of whom had any reason to want harm. Arkwright began interviewing the villagers, taking down each account with care, though he grew increasingly frustrated with the strange, half-whispered anecdotes he received in return. One woman swore she'd seen the family walking up toward the old Winton woods just days before they vanished, hand in hand in silence as though entranced. A young boy claimed he saw James Higgins staring at his reflection in the village well, not moving, for nearly half an hour. When Arkwright pressed for more grounded testimonies, the villagers grew evasive. It wasn't defiance, it was fear. They weren't withholding facts for mischief or privacy. They genuinely seemed afraid of what they'd seen, or what they suspected. But it was the journal entries, the ones no one saw but him, that revealed what the case was doing to him. He began writing them after the fourth day. The first entry was composed clinical. No logical explanation yet. Family's disappearance defies patterns, no viable suspects, no indication of foul play. Note, the grandfather clock appears significant. But each subsequent note shifted in tone, gradually shedding its professionalism. One particularly chilling entry read, "Had a dream I was walking through the Higgins house again, but it wasn't empty. There were voices coming from behind the walls, calling names, mine included. I followed them to the study, but the door was gone. There was only a mirror, and I could see someone behind me who wasn't me." Colleagues from Exeter who visited to support the investigation noted that Arkwright had become withdrawn, distracted. He'd sit in the study for hours staring at the walls, scribbling in his notebook. When asked what he was doing, he replied only, "Listening." The final entry in his journal, dated 1 week after he closed the official case report as unsolved, no evidence of voluntary disappearance or third-party involvement, was written in a hasty, near-illegible scrawl. "I saw the man, hollow-eyed, watching me from the tree line. Same as Margaret described, he's not a man. Not really. He's waiting for someone to open the door again." After that, Arkwright never returned to Dunwich Hollow. He refused to speak publicly about the case, and within the year, he quietly resigned from the force. Some said he had taken ill, others whispered about a breakdown. He left behind no family and disappeared into early retirement, somewhere near the Welsh coast. The Higgins case remained the only one he never solved. The grandfather clock stood in the study like a sentry, tall and solemn, his polished face catching the late autumn light through the half-shuttered windows. It had once been a thing of pride, Margaret Higgins told a neighbor, just weeks before the disappearance. A family heirloom passed down from Edward's great-uncle. It had been meticulously maintained and never missed a beat, until the night the Higgins family vanished. When police entered the house, the clock had stopped ticking. Not slowed, not broken, just stopped. Its hands were fixed at precisely 2:17 a.m. That time quickly became a point of fixation. It was the only specific marker anyone could tie to the moment the family might have disappeared. No phone calls had come in or gone out after 10 p.m. Edward's briefcase had been packed for the following day, his watch still ticking when it was recovered from his bedside table. The kitchen showed a meal half prepared, boiled eggs untouched, toast half burned, a pot of tea long gone cold. The front door was unlocked, yet nothing had been taken or disturbed. But the study, locked from the inside, was different. Detective Arkwright had been reluctant to force the door initially. It was solid oak, old and well-maintained, and the lock showed no signs of tampering. No one had a key, not even Margaret, according to her sister. When the constable finally pried it open with a crowbar, the room beyond was thick with stillness. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture or broken glass. Everything was neatly arranged, as if Edward had just stepped out for a moment. But that clock, silent, frozen, dominated the room with its quiet defiance. Arkwright returned to the study several times during the investigation, each visit leaving him more unsettled than the last. On the fourth night, he sat alone in the chair at Edward's desk, the one facing the clock. Rain tapped against the window panes, and the house creaked faintly in the wind, but otherwise it was silent. He found himself watching the clock as if it might start again on its own. Something about it felt deliberate. The stillness wasn't accidental. It was as if the clock wasn't broken, but waiting. His gaze wandered around the room. He examined the books lining the shelves, most of them legal texts, but a few strange volumes stood out. A worn copy of The Golden Bough, a collection of hermetic writings, and an obscure treatise on threshold states in time and consciousness. Arkwright wasn't a superstitious man, but even he couldn't ignore the oddness of those titles among the dry legal tomes. When he opened the glass casing of the clock face to inspect the hands, he noticed something strange. The hands were perfectly aligned, too perfectly. They didn't wobble or shift even slightly when touched. In fact, he had to exert real force to move them, and when he did, they snapped back to 217 the moment he let go. No mechanism should behave like that, not even a broken one. He made a note of it, but when he described it to a horologist brought in by the department a few days later, the man looked at him with a mixture of confusion and concern. "That's not possible," he'd said simply. "Clocks don't do that." Later, while examining the rear panel of the clock for serial numbers or hidden mechanisms, Arkwright discovered something wedged behind the pendulum, a piece of paper folded many times, tucked deep into the cavity where it shouldn't have been able to fall by accident. It was a page torn from a notebook, the handwriting small and erratic, and it read, "At 2:17, the veil thins, not broken, open. If you're reading this, don't listen to the ticking. It doesn't count time. It counts distance." He didn't know whose hand had written it. The style didn't match Edward's writing samples, and Margaret's was neater. James and Lily were too young. The ink had faded, as if it had been there a long time. But again, the clock had only recently stopped. Arkwright felt a chill then. Not from the drafty windows or the storm outside, but from something else, something behind the feeling, as though the house itself had heard the note being read and was waiting for a reaction. The next morning he returned with a police technician to document everything in the study. They brought photographic equipment and measuring tools, but something went wrong. The technician's watch, a brand new wristwatch bought just a week prior, began ticking erratically the moment they entered the study. His hands shook when he tried to reset it, and he claimed to feel a pressure in his ears, like being underwater. They didn't stay long. Eventually, the room was cordoned off and declared sealed. Arkwright recommended no further access be granted until the investigation turned up new leads, though none ever did. The clock remained silent and unmoving, its hands locked at 2:17. The moment time had apparently stopped for the Higgins family. No one in Dunwich Hollow ever heard it tick again. It was only after the early searches had been exhausted and the investigation stalled that questions about Edward Higgins' past began to surface. For days, the village and the authorities had focused on the present, on the quiet family home, the mysterious study, the strange drawings and the frozen clock. But as whispers continued and details from his earlier life trickled in, a different picture began to form, one that stretched beyond Dunwich Hollow and far back into the years before Edward and Margaret had ever set foot in the village. Edward Higgins had always been somewhat reserved, polite to a fault but distant, as if part of him remained just beyond reach. Most assumed it was the natural air of a man who had worked in law, someone used to keeping his emotions tucked behind a stiff collar. But those who knew him well, and there were few, had noticed a deeper weariness in him. Margaret, on rare occasions when the wine had been flowing after church events, had once remarked to her sister that Edward carried things he refused to name. She never elaborated. It was only when Detective Arkwright began to cross-check employment records that he discovered a long gap in Edward's official career. From 1942 to 1946, height of the war years, Edward's whereabouts were unaccounted for. No legal firms, no public service records, no military enlistment under his name. But a discreet inquiry with contacts in London eventually turned up something interesting. A classified designation tied to a now-defunct government department known as the Department of Advanced Research and Signals, DARS for short. Officially, DARS was dissolved in 1951, and its archives buried under layers of bureaucratic fog. Unofficially, the department had been involved in what one document euphemistically referred to as nonlinear atmospheric testing, a project designed to explore the theoretical intersections of time, electromagnetic fields, and cognitive interference. Edward Higgins had worked as a civilian analyst attached to the group. Arkwright, now well beyond his jurisdiction, followed what threads he could. He tracked down a man in Norwich who had served as a logistics clerk for DARS and agreed to speak anonymously. The man confirmed that Edward had been involved in something known only as the Wenton Project, a wartime experiment that took place in an abandoned manor just outside of Wiltshire, a site rumored to have been a staging ground for experimental devices that, according to whispers, weren't meant to harm the enemy, but to bend the very rules by which reality was understood. According to the clerk, the Wenton Project was shut down suddenly after an incident in late 1945. The details were vague, shrouded in redacted memos and hushed resignations. But there had been a malfunction, or a breakthrough, depending on who you asked. Several individuals involved reportedly suffered psychological breakdowns, with symptoms that went beyond typical trauma. One, the man claimed, forgot who he was every day, like time had lost its hold on him. Another disappeared entirely while under observation. Arkwright couldn't find Edward's name directly tied to the incident, but he did locate a single document bearing his initials next to a notation. Return from Wenton, refuses to speak. Request, reassignment, or discharge. It was after this, apparently, that Edward walked away from his work. He married Margaret shortly after, relocated to Devon, and rarely spoke of his past. The manor in Wiltshire was eventually sealed, the land declared off-limits due to structural instability. But what struck Arkwright most was the name, Wenton Manor. He recalled that one of the villagers, an older man named George Fielding, had mentioned the old Wenton place in a half-joking tone when rumors began circulating about the Higgins family. At the time, it had seemed like a throwaway comment, one of many made when fear and gossip stirred together. But now it echoed with a new weight. There was more. Several weeks before the family vanished, Edward had been seen at the local library, poring over old county maps. The librarian, Mrs. Donnelly, remembered because he had asked specifically for pre-war survey records, particularly those showing the original foundation lines of properties near Dunwich Hollow. One of the sites he'd flagged was an abandoned tract just west of the village, marked on older maps as Wenton Field. It had once belonged to the same family that owned Wenton Manor. Whatever Edward had found, He had kept it to himself, but the change in him didn't go unnoticed. Margaret grew quieter in public. James began asking peculiar questions about places between places. And Lily's drawings, already strange, turned darker, more geometric, some featuring layered doorways and swirling tunnels, with shadowed figures watching from beyond. Some in the village later recalled a conversation overheard in the post office, Edward speaking sharply to someone on the phone, saying, "I told them it should have stayed sealed. It was never closed properly. I think it's waking up." By then it was too late. Whatever had begun in Wenton Manor 2 decades earlier had not ended. It had merely gone dormant. And now, through Edward, it had found its way into the Higgins home. And once opened, some doors don't close. The Higgins case was closed on paper, but never in spirit. By late December of 1965, the investigation had faded from headlines and official records, left only to echo in the empty rooms of the manor, and in the minds of those who could not forget. There were no arrests, no further sightings, no bodies recovered. Nothing that could satisfy a report, let alone explain what had really happened. The house on the hill stood untouched, sealed by local order, with its study locked, and the grandfather clock forever fixed at 2:17 a.m. The Higgins family, it seemed, had simply vanished, and without violence, without reason, without a trace. But the village remembered. For the first few weeks, the absence still felt like a delay, as though at any moment the front door might creak open, Margaret's voice might call out, or the children's laughter might return to the garden. But the days passed, and the silence deepened. No one moved into the house. No buyers came forward. The property remained frozen in time, like everything within had been paused rather than lost. Flowers wilted in the vases. Bread hardened on the counter. A newspaper yellowed on the porch step, its headline forever caught in a moment that now belonged to something else entirely. It didn't take long for the whispers to return. They were quiet at first, told at the pub after dark or while walking the long road back from church, but they multiplied. People began saying the house wasn't empty, not completely. A few swore they'd seen lights in the upper windows at odd hours, faint flickering like candlelight where no one lived. Others said they'd heard music. Lily's piano, soft and broken, playing a few trembling notes before falling silent. Some claimed the garden gate opened by itself slowly, as if someone invisible were leaving or entering. Children, who always seemed to sense what adults tried to ignore, began crossing the street to avoid the house. One girl ran home crying after seeing a shape in the upstairs window, something tall and still watching. A boy reported hearing someone call his name from the hedge near the Higgins property, though no one was there. And then there was the milkman, Mr. Callum, who refused to walk that route again. He said the last time he did, just after sunrise, he saw a shadow in the study window facing outward and the faint movement of the curtains, even though the windows were nailed shut. None of it could be proven. But in Dunwich Hollow, where everyone knew everyone and superstition was usually reserved for old stories by the fire, belief took root quietly and deeply. The Higgins home was no longer just a house. It had become a wound in the village, a place where the rules no longer applied. Some villagers attempted to rationalize it all. Perhaps the family had planned their disappearance, orchestrated a clean escape. Perhaps they were victims of crime too well executed to leave evidence. But none of the theories explained the clock, or the strange marks in Lily's sketchbook, or the fact that their dog, Chester, had disappeared too, yet was later heard barking near the woods by Wenton Field, long after the search parties had disbanded. When a small group of curious teens ventured out there one evening to look for the animal, they returned pale and shaking, saying they'd gotten lost in a patch of fog that shouldn't have been there, and that they heard voices calling from the trees, voices that knew their names. Even those who dismissed the paranormal couldn't explain the weight in the air near the Higgins place, a heaviness that settled in your chest and made you breathe a little slower. Some swore their watches stopped ticking as they passed the gate. One woman, a nurse from nearby Totnes, had a mild seizure just outside the front path and later claimed she'd seen the clock face burned into her vision. By the spring of 1966, Dunwich Hollow had unofficially cut itself off from the house. No one spoke of buying it. No one even wanted to walk past it. Even the constables avoided their scheduled patrols near the lane. The vicar stopped blessing the path. The mail no longer came. It stood not just empty, but removed, severed from the rest of the world by fear and silence. And yet something remained. A year later, on the exact anniversary of the disappearance, just after 2 a.m., a passing lorry driver took a shortcut through the village and glanced up at the Higgins house. He saw 4 figures standing in the front window, perfectly still. 2 adults, 2 children, all facing outward. He didn't stop. He didn't report it until weeks later when asked by coincidence about the route. And even then his voice trembled as he said, "They weren't quite right. They looked like the family, but they weren't moving. And their eyes, if they had eyes, they were just black." After that, no one else claimed to see them again. But the sighting, the sounds, the strange stillness of the house, they never stopped completely. Something had been opened. Something had been left behind. A presence, perhaps, or a doorway, or just the memory of people who had stepped out of our world and into something else, leaving no trail except the echo of what used to be. The Higgins family was never found.